Today I'll be presenting a paper on the evaluation of pointing ray techniques for distant object referencing in model-free outdoor collaborative AR. I'm Ibrahim. My co-authors are Dr. Yuan, Feiyu, and Dr. Bowman. Before diving into the details, let me give some background. First and foremost, it is believed that awareness is important in collaborative tasks. To be more specific, joint attention on an object of mutual interest is a common requirement for many collaborative tasks. One example would be surveyors trying to simultaneously triangulate a distant target where they need to agree on the location of the target when they themselves are spatially separated. Another example would be two coaches planning the best possible course of action for their player where they need to refer to a specific location on the field and they themselves are spatially separated. Just like most human communications, when the collaborators are close to the target and they are close to each other, this is a fairly simple task. A user can just indicate the target by looking at it or pointing towards it and confirm via vocal communication. However, things could be much harder at larger distances when communication channels are limited. Laser pointers can come in handy in those situations. When two users are close together and they are talking about a close target, laser pointer can help identify the target because it's bright, because it's precise, and it's easy to follow. The effectiveness of laser pointer can be affected by lighting condition, distance of target, and visual information from the pointer. When the light is too bright and the ray is invisible, the observer can still do a visual search of the intersection point without worrying much about communicating with the pointer. However, when the users are distant from each other, this can be a problem because the target is at great distance and the intersection point is too tiny to spot. In an ideal AR scenario that has access to environment model, we can use a virtual ray to intersect with the target location, leaving visual highlights to help the observer understand the reference. But the real world is dynamic, and it's not always possible to get environment models. That is why we need model-free AR. In model-free AR, the ray cannot properly be occluded by, or intersect with the real world, because the ray does not stop at the target. It extends, making it ambiguous for the observer. Here, we define two types of ambiguities in the model-free environment with knife gaze ray. The first one is visual ambiguity, when the ray appears to be visually crossing multiple objects at the same time in the environment, like this picture here. The second one is spatial ambiguity. Here, the observer struggles with making correct spatial judgment when the target is surrounded by multiple objects, because they have limited information about the ray's orientation. Now, as you can see, visual ambiguity occurs when a single ray visually crosses multiple objects in the scene. We designed the double ray technique to address this issue. With double ray, a distant collaborator, aka a pointer, is asked to cast two rays pointing at two different geometric features. Typically, they are the top and the bottom of the target. The insight is that by increasing the number of rays aiming at different parts of the target, the visual magic condition is more strict than the single ray case. Instead of looking simply for objects over which a single ray passes, the user now looks for objects that are bracketed by the two rays. This enhancement could be further strengthened by asking the pointer to cast more rays at more features, although this would create more workload on the pointer and would also require more pre-agreement between the observer and the pointer, and it would rely heavily on the availability of the distinct geometric characteristics of the objects in the environment. We settled with 2 for maximal applicability. Now, another technique is parallel bar that aims to overcome spatial ambiguity by providing extra orientation cues to the observer to help them understand the ray's direction better. To do so, we first create a virtual segment that is parallel to the ray at the observer's chest height. Then, from the position of the observer, we find the direction that is perpendicular to the ray and place the same virtual burst along that direction with fixed interval. In this way, by seeing the direction of the bar and counting the number of bursts in front of them, the observer may have a better understanding of the ray's direction and distance. Combining with the location of the collaborator, the observer may know where the target is. The pros of this condition is that the observer has more information about the ray. The con of this condition is that the bursts may be harder to interpret, and the observer may have to go through a learning session to actually know how they can use the bursts to identify the target. Now, to evaluate these two techniques, we ran a AR simulation study in VR that is published in SUI 2019. We implemented the scene in VR with a giant chessboard to aid depth perception. We had 6 red spheres as targets, and a virtual collaborator worked as the pointer that could aim a perfectly accurate ray every time. The user's task was to find the correct target using the techniques. What we found out is that the observers were more accurate and efficient with double ray. On the other hand, the parallel bursts slowed down the observers. In this study, we partially replicated the previous experiment on a real-world wide area. We did our experiment on a site on campus with 7 actual lampposts as targets. We had 32 participants, that's 16 pairs of pointer and observer. For each technique, the participants took turns being an observer and a pointer to identify the target lampposts. We marked the lampposts with virtual spheres for better visibility and evaluation. Both the observer and the pointer were also identified with virtual avatars for better visibility. We had 2 independent variables for this experiment, number of rays and orientation cues, that gave us like 4 conditions: single ray with bar, double ray with bar. We had accuracy and time as our dependent variables. We also used the SAS questionnaire for the observer. We modified the SAS questionnaire and took out the questions that were less relevant to our experiment. We asked the pointers to take the raw TLS questionnaire. These are the questions that we aim to answer. The first 2 questions seeks to understand the effectiveness of the double ray and the parallel bar techniques on performance and subjective experience of the observer. The third question seeks to understand if there is a significant decrement of performance of the pointer when they are using the double ray technique. And the fourth question seeks to understand the kind of trade-offs that the pointer has to make to reduce the visual ambiguity for the observer. And here are the results for our experiment. Regarding the first question, we had a hypothesis that the double ray technique will have significantly better performance overall. As seen from the first image, we see that the observers were more accurate in the double ray technique compared to the single ray. In the second image, we see that the observers took more time in the double ray technique. But it was not an issue for 97% of the participants who said they preferred the double ray technique over single ray. Our second question was about the effectiveness of the parallel bursts. We hypothesized that the observers will be more accurate with the parallel bursts, but slower. We found out that the parallel bursts did not actually help with the accuracy, but they indeed significantly slowed down the observer, which led to a lower SAS score for the parallel burst techniques. However, most users still preferred the parallel bursts, especially when the only other information available was the single ray. For double ray, 59% of the participants preferred having parallel bursts over none. Our third question was about the usability of the pointer using double ray. We saw that the pointers took more time and made more errors in the double ray than the single ray technique. So it turns out the double ray is good for the observer, but bad for the pointer. So what kind of trade-offs does the pointer have to make this usable for the observer? That's where our last question comes in. Overall, our analysis revealed that the greater the pointer error, the lower the observer accuracy. We have seen from the last question that the double ray leads to higher pointer error. But we also saw from the first question that the double ray leads to higher observer accuracy, which means that the observers are more tolerant to double ray errors. That supports our hypothesis that the extra cost in usability by the pointer will ultimately pay off in increased performance by the observer. So, final takeaways from this study. Overall, for distant object referencing, our technique called double ray contributed to a better observer usability. Even though it was costly for the pointer, ultimately the cost paid off in the object referencing context. Secondly, the participants preferred the parallel burst, even though it did not help with the observer performance that much. We see that the finding from this real-world wide area study actually aligns with the findings from the previous simulated air study. We also got some additional insights from this study, such as the trade-offs the pointer and the observer need to make these techniques effective in real-world scenario. There are two ways this study could go in future researches. First, we could look for other artificial spatial cues to address issues in distant object referencing. Second, a major challenge in this work is to understand the trade-offs between the pointer and the observer. It would be nice to have a method for calculating a collaborative usability score for such techniques. It would help the designers to make critical decisions in designing collaborative systems. With that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you.